think that the visit was very comparable to how his other visits to the U.S. It seems like wherever he goes, no matter what country he goes to, no matter how small, there'll be an Indian community for him to engage with. Of course, his diaspora connect, the big thing he did in Long Island. This is such an important part of the U.S.-India relationship for him. The U.S.-India relationship has grown quite exponentially for the last few decades. Modi and Biden to be able to meet, to have that final engagement, to put an exclamation point on U.S.-India relations in the Biden era.
Whether Trump comes back to power or whether Kamala Harris makes her debut as the U.S. president come November, which way do you think the relations with India are going to be? How different are the approaches of these two people?
If Trump comes back, if he becomes president again, I think then you'd have to look at the possibility of trade issues, trade tensions. Just recently, in a campaign speech, when Trump had accused India, and when he was saying that India was an abuser, he was referring to India's tariff policy. So Harris, I think we could expect a fair amount of continuity from Biden. Things would be fine on the whole for the U.S. and India, regardless of who wins the election.
Quad meeting, the leaders meeting that was held. But how do you see Quad evolving? Do you see it evolving as a military partnership?
It's a complex thing, but it is a security grouping on many levels, but it's also a talk shop. So it's certainly a diplomatic tool.
A very volatile neighborhood. That presents a challenge to this ambition of becoming a great power, does it not?
And indeed, I think India is facing challenges in the neighborhood. The only big challenge for India in the neighborhood is Bangladesh. At the end of the day, the commercial relationship between the U.S. and India is very strong. They trade on a number of products. There's significant levels of investment, not just U.S. investment in India, but also Indian investment in the U.S.
Hi, you're watching The Times of India. I'm Aditi Prasad, and with me is Michael Kugelman. He's Asia Program Director at the Wilson Center's South Asia Institute. Welcome to the show, Michael. He's joining us from Washington, D.C., and therefore I can't help but ask you the big question. The race to the White House, how's it going?
Well, I think it's going to be down to the wire. It's going to be very close. And even if I were someone with the authority to make educated guesses about what's going to happen, I would be hesitant just because so many uncertainties and unknowns. And, as you know, there was a major change in the election campaign that came very recently when President Biden decided not to run. And so now you have Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, which was until very recently not what was expected to be the case with the two candidates. So we'll see. It's been described by so many in the U.S. as a critical election. We hear that term used a lot to describe elections in the United States. But I really just don't know what to make of it. I think it's going to come down to the wire. But it's hard to believe. But the election is now just mere weeks away here in the U.S. So we'll know soon enough what the result is.
So let me just turn to the area of your expertise, which is South Asia in particular. Now, a very, very crucial week, a very hectic week rather, in the US as far as the world is concerned. We know that the UNGA is going on, world leaders are descending. Prime Minister Modi also went for a visit. Just UNGA is happening right now. The Quad meeting happened just a couple of days ago. In your view, I'm talking about Prime Minister Narendra Modi, his meeting with Biden, the Quad meeting, all the other engagements. What's the view from Washington, D.C. as on date as far as India is concerned?
I think that the impression is that his visit went very well. I mean, there were no surprises. Everything, I think, went as expected. And really, I think that the visit was very comparable to how his other visits to the U.S. Have gone during his decade plus in power, right? I think you were able to tick off all the boxes. He engaged in the high level bilateral engagements. He did that on the at the Quad summit and elsewhere. He also had very high level engagements with top U.S. business leaders. That's the bit for him. That's a big priority with his emphasis on U.S.-India commercial cooperation. And finally, of course, his diaspora connect, the big thing he did in Long Island. This is such an important part of the U.S.-India relationship for him. And of course, as you would know, it's a big part of his foreign policy goals too. Whenever he makes a visit abroad, he will meet with the Indian community there. I mean, the Indian diaspora is so big, so global that it seems like wherever he goes, no matter what country he goes to, no matter how small, there'll be an Indian community for him to engage with. So yeah, I think it was quite successful, and there were no controversies that I'm aware of. And that's a good thing these days because it seems like there's always going to be a gotcha kind of moment. But yeah, I think things went well, and I think it was especially important this visit because it was really his last engagement with Joe Biden, with Biden as U.S. president. And I think that the U.S.-India relationship has grown quite exponentially for the last few decades, and that includes the 4 years that Biden was president. And I think it was important for Modi and Biden to be able to meet, to have that final engagement, to put an exclamation point on U.S.-India relations in the Biden era.
If there is, whether Trump comes back to power or whether Kamala Harris sort of makes her debut as the U.S. president come November, which way do you think the relations with India are going to be? How different are the approaches of these two people towards India are going to be?
The simple answer, which is accurate to a great extent, is that it doesn't matter, in the sense that U.S.-India relations, as I'd said before, have grown exponentially, continuously since the early '90s, and especially since the early 2000s. And during that period, you had alternating parties in power in the White House, Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
And we've seen this to be the case consistently. So I think that generally speaking, the relationship will be okay no matter who wins. But certainly, I think that one could expect there to be some differences particularly in terms of potential tension points, depending on who wins. I think that if Trump comes back, if he becomes president again, I think then you'd have to look at the possibility of trade issues, trade tensions returning. I mean, we know that when he was president last, there was this mini virtual trade war with India, mini trade war, because of the accusations he was making about India being a tariff king and all of that. And we saw just recently in a campaign speech when Trump had accused India, and when he was saying
Yeah.
that India was an abuser, he was referring to India's tariff policy. So trade
Hmm.
tensions didn't completely go away in the Biden era, but I think that the Biden administration was very careful not to do anything that could bring those back. It wanted to focus on other areas with India, but I think Trump would not hold back. And so that suggests that could be a fresh tension point. And I think perhaps looking at sort of more broadly speaking, Trump's policies in the Middle East, I mean, everything is very unpredictable. We don't know what he would actually do, but I think that he might take an especially hard line against certain countries in the Middle East, particularly Iran. Not that the Biden administration has been soft on Iran, but I think that the Trump administration could really take a very hard line toward countries like Iran that could perhaps make things a bit tricky for India, which of course looks to engage with countries across the board in the Middle East, including Iran, as well as many others as well. Now, Harris, I think we could expect a fair amount of continuity from Biden, but there are some indications that she might be someone that would be more willing to uh, publicly refer to human rights concerns or issues in India, such as the Kashmir issue. I wouldn't overstate that. She really hasn't said much about the Kashmir issue as vice president or even before. When she did run for president the last time, she did make some references to it and was critical. But I really think that was more to cater to certain audiences in the U.S. But there is that possibility, and we've seen she's been a bit more willing than Biden to bring attention to the suffering of the Palestinian people. So maybe this suggests that she would be more willing, or her administration would be more willing, to bring attention to domestic issues happening inside India that India's government would rather not be said. But I wouldn't overstate that possibility. So bottom line, things would be fine on the whole for the U.S. and India, regardless of who wins the election. But I do think there could be a few differences on the margins, depending on who wins.
Now, what I hear you saying, there's a little bit of an unknown as far as Kamala Harris is concerned, largely because, as you know, I was watching the show with Oprah that she did the other day. That there she was, pre-Biden, and then Biden exits the presidential race, and suddenly there's a new Kamala Harris on the horizon. She's suddenly come into her own and speaking her mind out very differently.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, she's trying to be presidential now in the sense that she knows that it's a strong possibility for her. Another point that I would refer to is, one that we all know about, that, she is an Indian American. And this is something, there've been many questions about what that could mean for US relations with India. It's it's difficult to say, though I do think, we have seen her in recent weeks, particularly since she became the Democratic candidate, more willing to discuss her Indian ancestry, more so than I remember her referring to it
Ever,
earlier in her political
exactly.
career. And that could be useful for U.S. India relations. I think it could help build goodwill. If she were to talk about her history, about her mother, those experiences, how her mother's experiences in the U.S. shaped Harris as a person. I think these are very positive, inspiring stories, and I think that could be helpful, particularly if she wins the presidency early on, as she's trying to engage with Indian interlocutors. And I think that's just a good thing on a very personal level.
All right. Let me just digress a little and move on to Quad. Quad was one of the big, or is one of the big, alliances that India and America both are part of. The Prime Minister also, the Quad meeting, the leaders meeting that was held, again put emphasis on the fact that Quad is there. It's not going away. It seemed to be dying during the COVID years, but I guess that's a thing of the past now. But how do you see Quad evolving? Because as of now, it just seems as a sort of a diplomatic partnership between nations. Do you see it evolving as a military partnership?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you referred to it as an alliance. I don't think it's seen as one. Certainly not by the four Quad members. It's a complex thing because you're right. I think that it sort of struggled to define itself in terms of what specifically it is. It's not an alliance, but it is a security grouping on many levels. But it's also a talk shop. So it's certainly a diplomatic tool. It's also an entity that has been projected as something that's meant to provide manufacture and produce and provide public goods to countries across the Indo-Pacific, like clean energy technologies, pandemic vaccines, and all that. But it has struggled, I think, to define it, to develop a clear identity. But to your question, I think it's in very good shape. It's true that it has an inherent challenge in that it's not a formal entity. It doesn't have a secretariat, it doesn't have a formal letterhead. And that's why it's very important that the continuity element be in place. And the fact that you had this summit in Delaware in recent days is important. There had been concern that there would not be a leaders summit
Yeah.
this year because, of course, it was scheduled to happen in India this year. It was very busy with the political calendars on the Indian side, and then on the U.S. side, a concern that Biden would not be able to travel to India. And so the fact that at the last minute they decided to have it here, that's significant. And it's now been, I think, 4 years in a row that they've had an annual leaders summit, which is impressive in this day and age when there's so many big distractions and things blowing up literally and figuratively around the world. So the fact that they've been able to stay grounded and have this continuity with the highest level representation 4 years in a row, I think that's definitely a good thing. And I think its future prospects are good. The main reason for that is that, let's be very clear, even if it's never mentioned publicly by the Quad leaders, China is really the reason why this group has been reemerged and re-energized after a number of years of going quiet. All four Quad states have seen their relations with China fall to their lowest levels in many years. And so long as that remains the case, so long as each of the Quad states wants to work together to counter China, the Quad will remain relevant and I think impactful. So two of the four Quad leaders soon to be out of power, the U.S. and the Japanese leaders, I don't think that's going to impact the future prospects for the group. And it seems that India is committed to hosting next year's annual leaders summit. I'm sure it'll happen. And in that regard, I think that it is in a pretty good it is in a pretty good place. At the end of the day, these are four countries that simply get along very well, both bilaterally and multilaterally, and there's a very strong shared strategic convergence, that of the shared desire to counter in China. So I think that suggests to me that the Quad will be quite all right.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today and for giving us insights that, of course, only somebody from a very outside perspective can hand it to us. Thank you.